I woke up to silence. Not the kind of quiet you expect in the dead of winter when the wind howls and the snow crunches underfoot. No, this was different. It was a heavy, unnatural silence that pressed down on me like a physical weight. When I looked outside, every single light in the village was out. The radio was dead. Not a single soul stirred. And I was the only one left. I still don't know how it happened. One day my Alaskan village was alive, full of voices, dogs barking, the hum of generators fighting the cold. The next, gone. Like they vanished into thin air while I was asleep. No warning, no chaos, just nothing. I thought it was a bad dream at first. Maybe I'd slept through some emergency evacuation. But there were no evacuation orders, no calls, no snow machines hauling people out. Just empty houses, half-eaten meals, and silence so thick it made my skin crawl. I'm going to tell you exactly what happened here. Because if it happened to me, in the middle of nowhere where nobody can hear you scream, it could happen anywhere. The day before everything went silent was like any other in our village. It's the kind of place where everyone knows your name, your schedule, your habits, where the rhythm of life is dictated by the cold and the land. I woke up early, as usual, the sharp scent of wood smoke in the air mixing with the faint musk of frozen earth. Outside the sun was low, barely climbing above the horizon, casting long shadows over the snow-packed roofs. I threw on my gear and headed out to check the traps. The forest was quiet, but not empty. There were signs animals had passed through. Broken branches, fresh tracks in the snow. But some of those tracks didn't make sense. I found a hare frozen mid-leap, eyes wide, stiff as ice. It looked like it had been caught in a snap, but there was no blood, no sign of struggle. Just frozen. Back in town, the generator buzzed louder than usual, like it was straining. At the general store, folks exchanged worried looks, but kept their voices low. Dogs barked at shadows I couldn't see. On the radio, static hummed beneath faint, distorted voices that crackled in and out, sometimes urgent, sometimes pleading, sometimes just nonsense. I thought maybe the cold was messing with the frequencies. Still, something was off. The usual chatter was missing. I stopped by the neighbor's cabin. Empty. The door was unlocked, breakfast untouched on the table. I called out, but my voice seemed swallowed by the cold air. I told myself to stop overthinking. Maybe they'd gone on a run to the nearest town. Maybe the radio had glitched. But as night crept in, the unease settled deeper, like a weight tightening around my chest. I went home, locking the door behind me. The distant howl of the wind a warning I couldn't ignore. That night I didn't sleep. I stared at the darkness outside, waiting for something, anything to break the silence. The night swallowed the village whole, and with it, any hope that this was just some strange fluke. The lights didn't flicker back on. The radio stayed dead. I wrapped myself in every blanket I could find, but the cold crept through the walls, settling into my bones. I needed answers, so I stepped outside into the frozen blackness. The snow underfoot was untouched. No footprints, no sign anyone had left or come back. It was as if the world had paused, frozen in place. I made my way to the neighbor's house, heart pounding against my ribs like a warning drum. Their door was wide open. Inside, the kettle was still warm, but the room was empty. No sign of struggle, no note, nothing. I checked the next house. Same thing. Plates half cleared from dinner, clothes tossed on chairs, a lamp left burning. It was like everyone had vanished midday, mid-breath. Vehicles sat parked in driveways, engines cold, keys still in the ignition. I ran my fingers through the snow, desperate for footprints or tire tracks leading anywhere but here, but found nothing but untouched powder. My radio crackled faintly, then nothing but static. I fumbled for the emergency beacon, a last hope, and sent out a distress call. The reply was static again. No confirmation, no rescue. I wasn't alone out here, though. Something was watching me. I could feel it in the prickling of my skin, the shallow quickening of my breath. Every shadow in the tree line felt alive, stalking, waiting. At one point I thought I saw a figure slip behind the trees. But when I shone my flashlight, there was nothing there but snow and branches swaying in the wind. I stumbled back home, heart racing, panic rising. I locked the doors, double-checked the windows, and sat in the dark, waiting for the dawn to bring some kind of answer. But the silence only grew heavier, thicker, like it wanted me to break. I couldn't sleep that night. The shadows outside my window seemed to crawl closer, pressing against the glass like invisible fingers. I needed to find something, anything that could explain this nightmare. That's when I remembered the old trunk in my grandfather's cabin, locked tight for years. He was a quiet man, full of strange stories nobody wanted to hear. Stories about the land and its secrets. I grabbed my coat and snow boots, the cold stabbing through the thin fabric, and made my way across the village, now more ghost town than home. The snow crunched beneath me as I forced open the cabin door. Inside, dust motes floated in the weak light of my flashlight, and everything smelled like old wood and memories. I found the trunk beneath a loose floorboard, just like my grandfather said it would be. Inside, wrapped in oilskin, was a leather-bound journal, yellowed with age. His handwriting was spidery but legible. He wrote about something called the hollow time. It was a curse or a warning, something the old ones feared more than the freezing cold or the wolves. The land itself, he said, had cycles, times when it takes back what it lent. People disappeared before, sometimes for days, sometimes forever. The village was built on sacred ground, disturbed and forgotten, and the hollow time was its way of reclaiming. I laughed it off at first, ghost stories to scare kids. But as I read, a creeping dread took hold. The journal described strange loops in time, places that folded back on themselves, traps in the snow where travelers vanished without a trace. I decided to leave. I took my snowmobile, hoping to escape to the nearest outpost. But when I hit the main road, the snow had swallowed it whole. No tracks, no road signs, just endless white stretching in every direction. Every path I took somehow led me right, back to the village. It was like the world itself was folding around me. I wasn't just alone anymore. I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The nights grew colder, darker, and longer, twisting my mind into knots. Hunger gnawed at my stomach, but the fear was worse. Fear that something had claimed the village, something older and more patient than any beast. I started seeing them, figures standing just beyond the edge of the tree line. Their faces were pale, eyes empty like shards of ice. They didn't move or speak, just stared silently into the dark. I tried to call out, but my voice was swallowed by the wind. At times I swore I heard faint whispers, soft and mournful, slipping through the night air. I set traps around my cabin, hoping to catch whatever haunted this place, but nothing triggered. I lit fires, hoping the smoke would drive them away. The flames flickered, then died, as if the cold itself fought back. I prayed, not to God, but to the land, to whatever spirit lingered here. Desperation clawed at me when I realized the land wasn't just watching, it was alive, remembering every footstep, every breath taken on its soil. It was angry. On the last night, I forced myself outside, heart hammering. The village was bathed in eerie moonlight, snow glistening like shattered glass. The figures appeared again, lining the edge of the forest. I faced them, voice steady but shaking. "What do you want from me?" No answer, just the cold, endless gaze. Then, a sudden rush of wind, biting and raw, swept through the village. The world seemed to tilt and shift. I collapsed to the ground. When I woke up, I was back in my cabin. Morning light streamed through the windows. No footprints, no frozen animals, no spectral watchers. Had it been a nightmare? Or had I survived the land's hunger? I still don't know. But the silence. It's never truly gone. Days later, a rescue team finally arrived. Late, snowed in, wary of the silence that greeted them. They found the village empty, not a soul in sight. No signs of struggle, no bodies, no footprints beyond my own. It was as if the village never existed, like a ghost town erased from the map. They questioned me, eyes full of disbelief as I recounted the vanished neighbors, the empty houses, the cold that seemed to watch. They said I must have lost my mind, that the isolation and cold can do strange things to a person. Maybe they were right. Maybe I'm just a man alone with his memories and fears. But sometimes, in the city's noise and warmth, I hear whispers, soft and hollow, carried on the wind. At night I feel the cold creeping under my skin, like the land is reaching for me, reminding me that I never truly left. What if I didn't survive either? What if I'm just what the land left behind? And now, every time I close my eyes I wonder, is the silence still waiting for me to come back? I don't know what time it was when I woke up. My phone was dead and the fire had long gone out. All I saw through the tent's mesh window were shadows, dozens of them, tall, still, standing in a wide circle just beyond the tree line. They weren't moving. Not swaying with the wind, not breathing, just watching. I stayed completely still, afraid even to blink too hard. I thought maybe I was still dreaming, some kind of sleep paralysis or hallucination brought on by the cold. But the air was sharp in my lungs. My heartbeat wasn't part of any dream, and I could hear them. That was the worst part. The sound of nothing. Not a footstep, not a whisper. Just a heavy, deliberate silence like the forest itself was holding its breath. I tried to whisper for Jake, but he didn't answer. He was zipped up in the sleeping bag next to me, but his body was stiff and cold. And when I shook him, he didn't respond. I don't know how this started. I don't know what they are. But I can tell you how we got here. And why I'll never step foot in Alaska again. It started as a detour. Jake and I had just wrapped up a welding job in Anchorage, and instead of flying back right away, we figured we'd take a few days to drive out into the wilderness, off-grid, just us like we used to do when we were younger. He always talked about Alaska like it was some untouched God's country. You've never seen real sky till you've seen it up here, he'd say. So we loaded up the truck with gear, grabbed a topo map, and picked a stretch of land between Tok and some no-name pass that barely even showed up on GPS. No cell service. No tourists. Just miles and miles of pine, rock, and snow. We knew how to camp, how to hunt, how to read a trail. We weren't amateurs. But looking back, we were cocky. The further we got from the paved roads, the more the world changed. Trees grew thicker, darker. The snow started falling heavier, and every so often we'd pass a stretch of land that felt wrong. No birds, no tracks, no signs of life. Like the forest had swallowed something whole and hadn't digested it yet. We stopped for gas at this tiny, run-down place with one pump and a busted neon sign that just said food. Inside, it was like stepping into the 70s. Dim lighting, dusty shelves, and a man behind the counter who looked like he hadn't seen a toothbrush in a decade. Jake made small talk, trying to ask about the trailheads nearby. But the guy just stared at us for a few seconds too long before muttering, "Some places out there don't like being remembered. Best not to camp off the road." I chuckled awkwardly, thinking it was just local superstition. But Jake didn't laugh. He nodded, thanked the man, and walked out without buying anything. Back in the truck, I asked him what that was about. He just said, "He's not the first one I've heard that from." We drove on for another hour and a half, finally pulling off at a clearing near a frozen creek. It was perfect, secluded, flat, just enough tree cover. But as I stepped out of the truck and looked into the woods, something in me hesitated. It felt like we were being watched. Even then, the first night should have been uneventful. It started that way anyway. We set up camp before dark, pitched the tent, stacked firewood, set a perimeter with bear bells and fishing line like Jake always did. By the time the sun dipped below the trees, we had dinner cooking and a fire crackling. It was cold but manageable. And the silence? At first it was beautiful, clean, like the whole world had hit pause. But after the first hour, it started to feel hollow. I noticed it when Jake stopped talking mid-sentence. We were laughing about some job site story, and then suddenly he just froze, eyes on the tree line. I followed his gaze, but there was nothing. No movement, no sound. Just trees and dark. Thought, I saw something, he muttered, shaking his head. Probably a moose. But he didn't look convinced. Neither was I. Later that night, as we sat by the fire sipping whiskey, a cold gust of wind came through and carried something strange with it. A smell. Faint, but sharp. Like burnt meat mixed with rot. It passed almost as quickly as it came. Smells. Like a dead animal, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Jake didn't answer. He just tossed another log on the fire and stared into it, jaw clenched. When we finally climbed into the tent, I had this strange sense of pressure, like the woods were leaning in on us. I told myself it was just the dark, the cold, the isolation, playing tricks. But then, around 3 a.m., I heard it. A soft snap. Like a twig breaking under weight. I sat up slowly, heart pounding. I held my breath, straining to hear over the blood rushing in my ears. Another snap. Closer. I unzipped the inner tent just a little and peeked out the mesh. Nothing. But the fire had gone out. No light, no moon, just pitch black between the trees. Was about to wake Jake when everything went still again. Like the forest had heard me listening. I lay back down, eyes wide open, gripping the small hunting knife I kept under my mat. Eventually, sleep took over. But the next morning when I stepped outside, I noticed something odd. A single boot print. Bare. No tread, no socks. Just the imprint of a naked foot. Pressed into the snow right outside the tent. I called Jake over to see the footprint. He studied it for a long time, not saying a word. No animal could have made it. It was clearly human. Heel, arch, toes. But it was wrong. Too long, too thin. And the toes looked almost clawed, like they'd curled into the snow before disappearing into nothing. We circled the tent, checking for others, but found none. Just that one, like someone had stepped out of thin air. We need to move camp, I said. Jake didn't argue. We packed everything in silence, drove an hour deeper into the wilderness, and set up near an old logging trail. It felt safer somehow, more open, but the tension followed us. That night, Jake barely said a word. He just kept feeding the fire, eyes flicking toward the trees every few minutes. I asked if he was okay, and he finally admitted he hadn't slept the night before. Had this dream, he said, voice low. Felt like I was awake but couldn't move. And there was someone in the tent, standing over me, just watching. I tried to laugh it off, but something about the way he said it. It wasn't like him. Jake was the tough one, the rational one. He didn't talk about dreams. When I went to relieve myself near the edge of the tree line, I swear I saw movement. Just a flicker, like someone stepping behind a trunk. But when I shined my flashlight, there was nothing. No branches swaying. No animal sounds. Just silence. I walked back faster than I'd care to admit. Around 2 a.m. I woke up again. This time, Jake was gone. His sleeping bag was empty, his boots missing. I called out softly, once, twice, but got no answer. I stepped out of the tent with the flashlight and followed the boot prints. They went straight into the woods. No hesitation, no stumble. Like he was walking with purpose. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. I was just about to follow the tracks when Jake came out of the trees. No flashlight. No coat. Just standing there in the cold like he didn't feel it. You okay? I asked, my voice shaking. He looked at me. Blank, his eyes not quite meeting mine. I was dreaming, he said finally, but I wasn't asleep. And then he crawled back into the tent. Didn't say another word. I barely slept after that. Every sound outside the tent felt amplified. The wind against the canvas, the creaking trees, the faint cracking of snow under pressure. I kept my hand on the knife the whole night, half waiting for Jake to sit up and start speaking in tongues or something. But he just lay there, still, breathing slow. At some point, I think just before dawn, I finally dozed off. And then I woke up to silence. Not just the usual quiet of the woods. This was dead silence. No wind, no creaks, no crunching snow. Even my breath felt too loud. I blinked a few times and looked toward the mesh window of the tent. That's when I saw them. Figures, dozens of them. Standing in a wide circle around the campsite, still as statues. I couldn't make out their faces. They were tall, too tall, like someone had stretched a human silhouette just a little past natural. No clothes, no features, just shadows pressed against the gray dawn sky. I didn't move. I couldn't. My mouth was dry, heart thudding like a drum in my chest. I whispered for Jake. Nothing. I turned slowly. He was in his bag, unmoving, eyes open, staring at the roof of the tent like he was in a trance. I shook him, harder this time. Blinked, looked at me and whispered, "Don't move, they're not real if we don't move." "What are they?" I breathed. He just closed his eyes again. I didn't wait to find out. I unzipped the tent as slowly as I could. The figures didn't react. I stepped out barefoot onto the snow. My boots were gone. Everything was gone except my knife and the flashlight. I didn't care. I walked slowly toward the trees, away from the circle. I couldn't look at them. Something inside me screamed not to. I made it 10, maybe 20 feet before I felt something behind me. Not footsteps, not breathing. Just a pressure, like something enormous leaning in, just shy of touching. I turned. There was nothing. The figures were still there, unmoving, watching. I ran. Didn't look back. Didn't stop until my lungs felt like they'd explode. Until the sun crested and the trees began to thin. When I finally turned around, the clearing was empty. No tent, no Jake, no tracks. Just snow. And silence. I stumbled out onto a service road hours later, mud-caked, barefoot, barely coherent. A snowplow driver spotted me, said I looked like I'd crawled out of a grave. When I told the troopers what happened, they launched a search. They found nothing. No camp, no gear, no tire tracks, not even a footprint besides mine. Jake's never been found. They asked if we'd been drinking, using anything, but I wasn't. I know what I saw. I still see it every time I close my eyes, the way those things just stood there, like they'd been waiting for us, like we were the ones trespassing. Tried to explain it to Jake's sister. She just cried. That was 6 months ago. Since then, weird things have started happening. Lights flickering at night, doors unlocking on their own. Sometimes I wake up and the smell from the woods, the rot, the burnt air. It's in my bedroom. Last week, I saw a shape standing at the edge of my backyard, just barely in the shadows. Tall, still, watching. I left Alaska, burned everything we had from that trip, but it doesn't matter. Whatever I saw out there, it followed me home. The night air bit into my skin like 1,000 tiny needles as I pulled off the highway, the headlights cutting through the thick curtain of darkness that had swallowed the Alaskan wilderness whole. The road behind me vanished into nothing but frost and snow, and ahead lay the frozen lake, black glass stretched wide beneath the moonless sky. I was alone, miles from the nearest town, parked at the edge of that endless ice with only the hum of the engine and the distant howl of wind. For company, I wasn't supposed to stop here, not at midnight. But exhaustion had clawed its way into my bones and the truck's heater was fading fast. The way the shadows flickered across the ice made my stomach twist. At first I thought it was the wind playing tricks on my eyes, but then I saw it, a figure slipping just out of reach, moving slow, deliberate. It didn't belong to me, and it wasn't standing on solid ground. The cold pressed down on me like a weight, heavier than the freezing air itself. I kept telling myself, it was nothing. Just my imagination fueled by too many hours alone on the road. But when you're out here with nothing but a frozen lake and the darkness that swallows it whole, Nothing feels safe anymore. I didn't know it then, but that night would change everything. I saw shadows moving across the frozen lake at midnight, and whatever was out there was waiting for me. I hit the road earlier that day, the endless stretch of highway cutting through Alaska's wilderness like a lifeline. It wasn't my first time driving these parts, but the isolation always gets under your skin. Before leaving, I stopped at a tiny gas station, the last outpost before the real wilderness swallowed the road. The place felt off. The clerk's eyes were cold, his smile forced. I caught whispers from locals about people vanishing near the lakes out here, but I shrugged it off as typical small-town superstition. Behind the gas station, weathered signs warned of thin ice and treacherous conditions. But nothing prepared me for the eerie silence that greeted me once I reached the frozen lake. No birds, no animals, just the crunch of my boots on snow and the faint creak of ice settling beneath me. As I parked the truck, I noticed a faded missing person poster nailed to a nearby tree. The face stared back at me. Someone last seen, near this very lake years ago. The cold prickled at my skin, but I pushed down the unease, telling myself I was here for a quick rest, nothing more. I set up to sleep in the truck, but even inside, I felt the weight of the silence pressing in. The shadows cast by the pale moonlight on the ice seemed to shift when I wasn't looking, flickering at the edge of my vision. It was like the lake itself was breathing, watching. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Something was out there, moving just beyond the edge of the light. And for the first time that night, I wondered if maybe those old stories weren't so crazy after all. The night wrapped around me like a shroud as I lay in the truck, the heater long dead, the cold creeping through the cracked window edges. Every sound was amplified in the silence. My breath, the occasional pop of settling ice, the distant howl of wind slicing through the trees. Then, something else. A faint scraping noise on the lake's surface, soft but deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and forced myself outside. The snow crunching under my boots. Across the frozen lake, shadows moved. Slow, silent figures gliding just beyond the reach of my light, slipping over the ice without a sound. I blinked, convinced it was a trick, but there they were again, shifting shape, growing closer, always just out of reach. My heartbeat hammered in my chest as I tried the truck's ignition. Nothing. The engine was dead. No warmth, no escape. I swung the flashlight wildly, catching glimpses of shapes that vanished the moment I focused on them. The wind picked up, howling around me, and I realized how utterly alone I was, trapped between the frozen lake and the creeping shadows. Fear gnawed at my mind, but it was more than that, something primal, like I was being hunted. And the worst part? The shadows didn't make a sound. They just watched, waiting. I thought the best move was to get away, find the ranger station or at least some sign of life. But as I stepped onto the ice, the shadows followed, gliding behind me without a sound or a single footprint to mark their passage. My breath caught in the cold air, and my mind started twisting things. Was this real or just exhaustion making me see things? I couldn't tell anymore. The cold was biting deep, stealing my strength, and the dark whispered my name like a twisted lullaby. Then came the scratching, something clawing against the inside of my jacket, subtle but unmistakable. I ripped my arms free, heart pounding as I spun around, but no one was there. Only the empty, frozen expanse and the shapes just beyond, the reach of my flashlight. Panic clawed at me, and my vision blurred as my mind battled between freezing cold and growing terror. Every step I took felt heavier, as if the shadows were pressing in, learning how to mimic me. Every breath, every move. I stumbled, disoriented, barely able to keep my footing on the slick ice. The whispering grew louder, almost pleading, but I knew better. Whatever this was, it wasn't human. It was something else, something ancient, patient, and hungry. I stumbled through the dark, my breath ragged and freezing on the icy wind until I found it. A dilapidated ice fishing shack, half collapsed, and buried in snow. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the stale air thick with dust and something else, decay. Inside, scattered pages from a weathered journal caught my eye, the ink faded but still legible. They told stories eerily like mine, people who'd seen the shadows, who'd felt the silent stalking on the ice, who never made it out. The entries spoke of a presence that mimicked human movements but wasn't human itself, something that learned from its victims before striking. A chill ran through me as I pieced it together. This wasn't some trick of the cold or mind, it was a predator, lurking beneath the frozen surface, watching, waiting. The shadows moved with purpose, their slow glide hiding something far more sinister beneath the ice. I knew I couldn't stay there, but the lake was no longer just frozen water, it was a trap. Every step I took echoed my own fear back at me, mirrored by those creeping shadows. When I finally tried to run across the ice, the surface cracked beneath my feet, the chilling sound snapping me back to the deadly reality. In that moment, I realized the lake wasn't just frozen, it was alive. And so were the shadows. When they finally found me weeks later, I was barely alive, half frozen, mumbling about shadows that watched, that copied, that waited. The doctors called it delirium, the cold, maybe even trauma. But I know what I saw. Those shadows didn't just move across the frozen lake, they learned from me, from every terrified breath I took. They mimic, they wait, and they hunger. Now, as I sit behind these sterile walls, staring out at the snow falling softly beyond the window, I feel it again. The weight of those dark shapes lurking just past the tree line, slipping silently across the ice. Some nights when the wind howls low enough, I swear I see them, moving like memories I can't forget. And I wonder, when I finally leave this place, will they still be waiting for me? Or for the next soul reckless enough to stop on the frozen lake at midnight? Because out here in the heart of Alaska's frozen silence, some shadows never disappear. They just wait. I'd always imagined Alaska as a place of silence. Endless forests, snow-dusted peaks, and air so clean it almost stung when you breathed it in. That was the dream I clung to as I drove deeper into the wilderness, my headlights cutting through a curtain of pines that seemed to stretch forever. The cabin I rented sat alone at the end of a winding dirt road, miles from the nearest town. Isolation wasn't a drawback for me. It was the entire reason I came. I wanted quiet. I wanted to disappear for a while. When I pulled up, the cabin looked ordinary enough. A squat wooden structure with smoke-stained shingles and a porch that sagged under the weight of too many winters. But as I unpacked my gear, I noticed something strange. Marks along the exterior wall, right beside the door. At first, I thought they were scratches from a bear. Alaska has plenty of those. But as I leaned closer, a chill ran down my spine. These weren't random claw marks. They were higher than a man could reach, carved deep into the wood in long, deliberate slashes. And no matter how long I stared, one thought wouldn't leave my head. No animal could have made those. The first night in the cabin felt heavier than I expected. The silence wasn't peaceful. It pressed down on me like a weight. Even the wind seemed reluctant to pass through the trees, and when it did, it carried a low, groaning sound that almost resembled a voice. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me. I spent the day stocking the woodpile and checking the small generator. Everything worked fine, but every time I circled the cabin, my eyes went back to those scratches. The wood around them was splintered, as though something with unbelievable strength had raked across it. I tried measuring them against my hand. Each slash was at least 3 times longer than my fingers. That evening, I drove back toward the nearest gas station, maybe 20 minutes down the road, just to grab a few things. The cashier, a gray-bearded man with a crooked ball cap, glanced at me when I mentioned which cabin I was staying in. His expression darkened, the easy small talk vanishing. "Place by the ridge?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual. He shook his head slowly. "You see anything out there, don't go looking for it." I laughed, waiting for him to crack a smile. But he didn't. His eyes had a seriousness that unsettled me more than the scratches. By the time I got back, the sun had dipped low, leaving the forest in a blue, fading light. I locked the door, built a small fire, and settled in with a book. Hours slipped by, but just as I started to relax, I heard it. Something moving outside. It wasn't the quick, skittish shuffle of an animal. It was slow, deliberate, footsteps circling the cabin. I held my breath, straining to listen. The fire popped loudly, masking the sounds, but when it quieted, I caught it again. Gravel crunching beneath weight. My heart pounded as I crept to the window, peering through the frost. Nothing. Just trees. But when I opened the door the next morning, my stomach dropped. The scratches had spread, now running along the side of the cabin I hadn't even noticed before. And they were fresh. The second night was worse. I tried convincing myself the new scratches were old, ones I had simply overlooked, but deep down I knew better. The edges of the wood were too clean, too sharp. Something had been here while I slept. I set a few traps around the perimeter before sundown. Just basic wire snares I'd picked up years ago. If it was a wolf or even a bear, I'd at least know. I spent the rest of the evening writing in my journal, trying to keep a record of everything. It made me feel less crazy, like if I documented it, I could make sense of it later. But once the fire dimmed and the cabin sank into shadow, the noises started again. At first it was faint, like the creak of the porch steps under weight. Then came the scraping, nails dragging across the wood in slow, deliberate motions. I gripped the flashlight in one hand, an old hunting knife in the other, and waited. That's when I heard it. Not footsteps, not claws, a whisper. It carried on the wind, thin and broken, but I swear it formed words. Too distorted to understand, but undeniably human. My skin prickled, every instinct in me screaming to run, yet I stayed frozen until the sound faded. Morning brought no comfort. When I stepped outside, every trap I'd set was destroyed. Snapped wires, bent stakes, even one torn clean out of the ground like it was nothing. And then I saw the new marks. The scratches weren't just at the walls anymore. They stretched higher, climbing toward the roof. Long arcs dug into the wood like something massive had been scaling the cabin. I drove back to the gas station that afternoon, desperate for answers. The same cashier was there, and when he saw me walk in, he muttered under his breath, almost like he expected me. "You're still in that place?" I nodded, feeling like a child caught in a lie. He stared at me for a long moment, then finally said, "Listen, what's out there? It's older than these trees. Don't think of it as an animal. Don't even think of it as a person. Just don't call it." I wanted to press him, to demand what he meant, but his eyes told me enough. He was terrified. And now, so was I. By the third night, the cabin no longer felt like a retreat. It felt like a trap. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, that the cashier's words were just small-town superstition, but every sound outside argued otherwise. I barely slept, lying awake with the flashlight clutched in my hand, staring at the ceiling as the hours crawled by. Sometime past midnight, I heard it again, footsteps circling, heavier than before. They paused right outside my bedroom window. The glass frosted at the edges, and for a moment I swore I saw a shadow lean across it, tall and unnatural. My breath caught, and I didn't dare move until the figure slipped back into the trees. The next morning I tried leaving. I packed everything into my truck, turned the key, and prayed for the engine to roar to life. Instead, it sputtered once and died. I tried again. Nothing. The gas gauge was half full, the battery new. Still, it wouldn't start. I sat in the cab for a long time, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The forest around me was silent, too silent, as if everything living had fled. That evening, as the sun bled out behind the tree line, I saw it again. Not clearly, not enough to understand what it was, but enough to know it wasn't human. The shape moved unnaturally between the trees, limbs too long, shoulders stooped at angles no body should bend. Every time I blinked, it seemed closer, as though the forest itself pushed it toward me. I locked every door, every window, and stoked the fire high, but it didn't matter. The moment night took hold, the pounding began. Not scratching this time. Not whispers. Pounding. The cabin shuddered with each blow, the wooden walls rattling as though something enormous was throwing itself against them. Dust rained from the rafters. My lantern swung violently on its hook. I pressed my back against the door, my knife trembling in my hand, heart hammering so loud I thought it might burst. The thing outside didn't want to leave marks anymore. It wanted in. I'd never felt fear like that night. The pounding against the walls came in intervals, as though it wanted me to anticipate each strike. The fire crackled weakly in the hearth, casting jagged shadows that seemed to shiver with every impact. My flashlight beam shook as I moved through the cabin, checking windows I already knew were locked. But locks didn't feel like enough. I retreated to the corner with my journal and knife, forcing myself to whisper what I was hearing, recording it like a confession. If anyone ever found this notebook, they'd know I wasn't imagining it. The air grew colder, unnaturally so, as if the fire wasn't even there. That's when I heard the voice again, closer this time. A warped, broken whisper threading through the wood. It sounded like my own name. I froze. The cabin groaned under, the weight of something pressing against it. The boards creaked, nails whining as though the walls themselves were bowing inward. My flashlight swept across the frosted window, and that's when I saw it. A face. Pressed against the glass. Pale and distorted with features stretched too far apart. Eyes that seemed both human and not, fixed on me with a hunger that made my chest lock tight. The breath fogged the window from the outside, proof that whatever it was stood inches away. I staggered back, heart clawing against my ribs. The pounding returned, shaking the door on its hinges. Every slam splintered the frame a little more, the wood cracking louder with each hit. The cashier's words rang in my head. Don't call it. But what did that mean? Was it here because I had acknowledged it? Because I had dared to notice the scratches? I screamed at it to leave, though my voice shook. For a moment, the pounding stopped. Silence pressed in thick enough to smother me. Then came a slow drag of claws across the door, long and deliberate like a warning. I backed into the corner, whispering to myself, convincing myself dawn would come, that it couldn't last forever. But as the fire died and the shadows deepened, I realized something that froze me to the core. It wasn't trying to break in. It was waiting for me to open the door. I don't know how much longer I can hold out. The walls groan with every push, the door frame splitting like dry bone. I can see the cracks widening near the hinges, splinters scattering across the floor. Whatever's out there isn't leaving. It's patient, smarter than I ever wanted to believe. I've been talking into this recorder for the last hour, documenting every sound, every whisper, every slam against the wood. If someone finds this, if someone hears this, don't make the mistake I did. Don't stay in the cabins with scratches. The whispers are louder now. They're not distorted anymore. They're clear, speaking in a voice that sounds like mine. It keeps calling me to the door, telling me it's safe, telling me I don't have to be afraid. But I know better. The fire's gone out. The cold is inside with me now, sinking into my bones. The last lantern flickers low, and with every shadow that dances across the walls, I see its shape outside the window. Taller, closer, waiting. The door just cracked. I can hear it breathing. If anyone's listening, the recording cuts off. I've been hunting in Alaska for nearly a decade, and I've never felt fear in these woods. Respect, yes. Awe, always. But fear? Never, until that night. The air was sharp enough to sting my lungs, and the snow crunched under my boots like broken glass. I'd left civilization behind hours ago, trading the hum of highways for the hollow silence of the wilderness. That silence felt different this time. Not peaceful, heavy. Like the whole forest was holding its breath. The tree line stretched endlessly in every direction, black silhouettes against a dim sky, their branches clawing at the windless night. No birds called, no water trickled, just the thud of my heartbeat echoing in my ears. My headlamp cast a pale cone of light over the narrow game trail, illuminating clouds of my breath that hung frozen in the air. I told myself this was why I came here. Solitude, challenge, the thrill of the hunt. But as I shifted the rifle on my shoulder and glanced over my back, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Something about this forest felt wrong, and for the first time, I wondered if I'd made a mistake coming here alone. By the time I reached a clearing to set up camp, dusk was bleeding into night. The sky turned a dull steel gray and the temperature dropped fast. My breath came out in thick plumes as I unstrapped my pack and laid out my gear: tent, sleeping bag, rifle, stove. I'd done this countless times before, but tonight my movements felt hurried, jittery, like I was racing some invisible clock. I built a small fire, its glow flickering against the surrounding trees, but it didn't make me feel any safer. The woods around me were too still, not the kind of calm that settles after a long day, but the heavy quiet that follows a predator's arrival. That's when I noticed the first sign: a broken branch, freshly snapped, dangling at an unnatural angle. Not unusual in the wild, but this one was high, at least 8 feet off the ground. My eyes scanned the surrounding trees. There were claw marks etched deep into the bark, long and jagged, like something had climbed or raked against it. I told myself it was probably a bear, but the prints I found in the snow later didn't look like bear tracks. They were too wide, too long, and too human. That night I lay in my tent with my rifle beside me, the fire dying outside. I strained my ears, listening. At first, there was nothing but my heartbeat. Then, faintly, something carried on the wind, a low, guttural sound, somewhere in the distance. Not a wolf, not a moose, something different. I froze, clutching the rifle tighter. The sound faded, leaving me alone in that suffocating silence. I reminded myself that I had hunted these woods for years, that nothing here could surprise me. But the reassurance didn't stick. Something felt off in these woods. Something felt wrong. Sleep never came easily that night. I kept glancing at the thin tent wall, watching the shadows dance in the moonlight. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of snow made my stomach tighten. I'd always prided myself on being calm under pressure, but this was different. This wasn't nerves. It was instinct. Instinct screaming at me to leave. Morning came slow and gray, a pale light filtering through the trees like smoke. I packed up camp quickly, trying to shake the unease from the night before. The forest looked calm again, beautiful even, the snow glistening like shards of glass. Maybe I'd overreacted. That's what I told myself as I followed a narrow game trail deeper into the woods, rifle slung over my shoulder, breath steaming in the cold air. Hours passed in silence. No birds, no movement, just the crunch of my boots and the whisper of wind through branches. I crouched to inspect a set of tracks in the snow, hoping for caribou or moose. That's when I saw it, something small, pale, and half buried under a dusting of snow. I brushed it off with my glove, expecting antlers or a leg bone. But it wasn't an animal bone. It was a human femur, gnawed at one end, the marrow hollow and dry. I froze, staring at it, my breath catching in my throat. The size, the shape, there was no mistaking it. I scanned the ground and saw more. A rib cage scattered across a mound of moss. A skull wedged between roots, its empty sockets staring at me. My stomach churned. The bones weren't just lying there. They formed a kind of path, like breadcrumbs leading somewhere. Against every shred of common sense, I followed. The deeper I went, the worse it got. Bones piled against tree trunks, spines twisted unnaturally, skulls balanced on rocks. Some were old, bleached white by years of weathering, while others looked fresh. The forest seemed to close in as I walked, the trees crowding together, their branches hanging low and heavy. My every step sounded deafening. I should have turned back. Every instinct screamed at me to. But there was something hypnotic about that trail, like I was being drawn forward. When I finally stopped, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The footprints I'd been following weren't mine. They were massive, bare footprints half filled with snow leading straight down the same path as the bones. And they weren't old. They were fresh. The footprints led me deeper into a part of the forest I'd never seen before, a place where the trees grew so tightly together that sunlight barely touched the ground. The air smelled different here, damp, metallic, and sour, like something rotting just out of sight. My pulse pounded in my ears as I crouched low, scanning every shadow. The footprints ended at a small, overgrown clearing, and that's when I saw it. A cabin. It leaned crookedly against a slope, its roof sagging under decades of snow and moss. The door hung half open, creaking in the wind that suddenly whipped through the trees. I raised my rifle, every muscle screaming to run, but something in me needed to know. Needed to see. Inside, the smell hit first. Thick, rancid, and choking. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, landing on shredded fabric nailed to the walls like trophies. The floor was littered with bones, some animal, some not. I knelt beside a torn jacket, its fabric stiff with dried blood. A bullet-riddled rifle leaned in the corner, snapped clean in half. The walls weren't smooth anymore. They were scarred with deep gouges, claw marks that had torn through wood like paper. I trailed my light upward and saw a set of antlers nailed above the doorway, not deer antlers. They were far too big. My breathing quickened. I backed away, trying not to make a sound, when something shifted outside. A branch cracked, slow and deliberate. I froze, heart hammering. Another crack, closer this time. Whatever was out there was circling. The sound of heavy breathing drifted through the cracked door, low and guttural, vibrating in my chest. I flicked off my flashlight, plunging myself into darkness, pressing against the wall as the footsteps crept closer. A massive shadow passed in front of the doorway, blocking out what little light seeped through. I held my breath as the thing sniffed the air, a deep rumbling growl following. It knew I was inside. The cabin groaned under its weight as it pressed against the walls, the sound of claws scraping wood echoing in the dark. My rifle felt useless in my shaking hands. I wasn't the hunter anymore. I was prey. I didn't think, I just moved. I lunged for the window, shoving it open with a loud crack as the doorframe splintered behind me. A guttural roar shook the cabin as I dove headfirst into the snow, scrambling to my feet. My flashlight swung wildly, slicing through the blackness, and for the first time I saw it. Just a glimpse, a hulking shadow slipping between trees, faster than anything that size should move. My breath tore through my throat as I sprinted, blindly into the woods, snow grabbing at my boots. The flashlight beam danced erratically over branches and roots, catching flashes of movement behind me. Each time I looked back, I saw nothing, but I could hear it. The crunch of snow, the sharp inhale of breath closing in. I raised my rifle and fired into the darkness, the recoil slamming into my shoulder. The shot echoed through the forest, but there was no cry of pain, no thud of a body, just silence. Then, another roar, closer this time, rattling my bones. Branches whipped my face as I ran, tripping, stumbling, clawing at the frozen ground. My flashlight flickered, then died, plunging me into blackness. I could hear it circling me now, every sound magnified in the still night. I crouched low, rifle trembling, in my hands, trying to steady my breathing. The snow around me shifted softly, like something massive was gliding through it. My pulse pounded so loud I couldn't tell if it was behind me or right in front of me. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. Not eyes, reflective, intelligent eyes watching me from a break in the trees. My breath caught as it lowered itself the way predators do before they strike. I fired again, then again. The shots echoed, ringing in my ears, but the thing vanished into the tree line, silent as smoke. That was my chance. I bolted, running until my legs burned, my lungs seared, and my vision blurred. I didn't stop, not when the forest grew darker, not when I heard it stalking just out of sight. I ran until I saw something familiar through the trees. My old campsite. But but safety still felt impossibly far away. By the time I stumbled back into the clearing where I'd camped, dawn was breaking. The pale light turned the snow a ghostly blue, but it brought no comfort. My fire pit was buried, my gear half frozen, but I didn't care. I grabbed what I could carry, slung my rifle over my shoulder, and started running again. My legs felt like lead, every breath cutting like shards of ice, but I didn't stop until I reached the dirt road where I'd parked hours away. The forest was silent behind me, that same oppressive, watchful silence I'd felt from the moment I arrived. I turned once, scanning the tree line. For a moment I swore I saw movement, a shift of shadow, a flicker of something massive, but then it was gone. I drove all day, not stopping once, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the wheel. When I finally reached town, I called a buddy to say I was done hunting. Alaska had beaten me. But the memory of that thing, the trail of bones, the footprints, those eyes, haunts me every time I close my eyes. And last night, I dreamed of those tracks again. Only this time they led straight to my front door. The polar night in Alaska isn't just darkness. It's a kind of silence that presses against your ears and seeps into your bones. I was parked on the side of a deserted highway, miles from the nearest town, with only my old rig and a radio that barely worked for company. The cold was biting, a sharp wind that cut through the cracks in the cab and made me pull my jacket tighter. Then out of nowhere, my radio flickered to life with something I wasn't expecting: screams. Not the kind you hear in movies or on the news, but raw, desperate, and twisted by static. At first I thought it was interference, maybe a prank from some other driver. But those screams didn't fade. They echoed in the long night like someone was trapped in the frozen dark, calling out for help or warning me to stay away. I leaned closer to the radio, heart pounding, knowing this was no ordinary night on the road. The screams didn't stop, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. I flipped through channels, hoping to catch some familiar voice or sound, maybe a dispatcher or another trucker. But all I got was static and that haunting wail bleeding through the cracks. The cold outside seemed to grow heavier, like the night itself was closing in, suffocating any chance of comfort. I thought about turning the radio off, shutting the door, and pretending I hadn't heard anything, but some part of me couldn't look away or stop listening. I stepped outside the truck, the flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. The snow under my boots was fresh but scattered with strange footprints that led off into the woods and then just stopped. The trees around me stood like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with ice, casting long, crooked shadows. My breath fogged in the air as I strained to hear any other sounds, but the only thing was the faint wind and those screams, echoing from some impossible distance yet close enough to chill me to the bone. I wanted to believe it was a trick of the radio or my tired mind playing games, but deep down I knew it wasn't. Something was out there, and it was calling me. I gripped my flashlight tighter and took a few more steps into the dark, the beam trembling as much as my hands. The footprints had disappeared, swallowed up by the shifting snow, or maybe something worse. The air around me grew colder, sharper, like the forest was holding its breath. Then I saw it. Strange carvings etched crudely into the bark of a tree, nearby. Jagged lines, almost like symbols, but nothing I recognized. My heart hammered as the screams came again, closer this time. Ragged, desperate, like someone pleading for help, or warning me away. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back. But I was frozen in place. The darkness wasn't empty anymore. It felt alive, watching, waiting. The silence between the screams was heavier than the noise, a crushing stillness that made every snap of a twig sound like a gunshot. I told myself I was just exhausted, maybe hallucinating. But when the radio crackled again, that raw, pained scream cut through the cold and straight into my soul. Whatever was out there wasn't just lost, it was dangerous. The night dragged on, thick with cold and dread. I stayed close to my truck, but the boundary between safety and the darkness outside felt thinner with every passing minute. The screams on the radio changed. They grew erratic, sometimes distant and hollow, other times shockingly close, like they were right on the edge of my senses. I couldn't tell if I was losing my mind or if something was truly stalking me in that frozen wilderness. I thought about the stories I'd heard before. Drivers disappearing without a trace, strange phenomena in the polar night, warnings whispered in hushed tones at truck stops. Now standing there in the silence between screams, I understood why. The isolation wasn't just physical. It burrowed into your mind, twisting fear into something almost unbearable. I fought the urge to panic, telling myself to focus, to keep calm. But as the hours bled into one another and the darkness refused to relent, my grip on reality slipped. The radio hissed with static, then crackled. Voices, murmurs layered beneath the screams, impossible to decipher but heavy with meaning. I was trapped in a nightmare that didn't seem to end, and whatever was out there wanted me to feel it. To know that I was not alone. The screams hit their peak, piercing, unrelenting, a raw howl that seemed to shake the very air around me. I slammed my hand against the radio, desperate to break through the static to find any signal of sanity. But all I got was silence. Then a flood of garbled whispers that crawled under my skin. The truck, my refuge all night, suddenly felt like a trap, a metal cage surrounded by the frozen unknown. I considered driving away, but the road was swallowed by snow and darkness. The headlights barely cut through the swirling night, and every shadow seemed to flicker with movement. My breath was shallow, my heart pounding in a rhythm I could barely control. The forest pressed in closer, alive with unseen eyes and whispered warnings. I stood at the edge of the cab, torn between fleeing into the endless black or staying put, and facing whatever haunted the polar night. The screams faded slowly, replaced by a suffocating silence that felt worse. And then just before dawn's fragile light threatened the sky, I heard it. A final, desperate cry fading into nothing. I didn't know if I'd made it through or if I was still caught in some frozen nightmare. But one thing was clear. The polar night keeps its secrets, and sometimes it lets you hear its screams. I watched the first pale light of dawn creep over the horizon, the long night finally giving way to a fragile day. The screams had stopped, but their echo still rattled in my mind, twisting every shadow and whisper into something darker. I climbed back into the truck, every nerve raw, unsure if I had escaped or if the nightmare was just waiting for the next polar night to return. The radio sat silent now, as if exhausted from carrying those tortured cries. I tried to tell myself it was over, that I was safe. But the cold emptiness inside me said otherwise. There are places in this world where silence hides more than peace, and darkness holds secrets that never want to be found. I drove away from that frozen stretch of highway, but the screams stayed with me, etched into my memory like frostbite. Sharp, painful, and impossible to forget. The polar night doesn't just steal the sun. Sometimes it steals something far worse. Your sense of safety, your grip on reality, and maybe even your soul.